Okay, so kind of where do we go from here? And we have some really, really great guests coming in this afternoon. So I've just kind of pulled together the faces of all of the people that have, participated in this process as experts. It was kind of, even I was surprised, like, wow, that was a lot of knowledge that we got imparted. And I know you didn't get a chance to talk to every one of these. I definitely encourage you to check out the notes because we've documented all these conversations as transcripts. And yeah, we've got some really great guests today. We've got Michael Piper coming back from rehousing to talk about the missing middle. We've got a planner from the city of Penticton and the city of Port Moody. And they're going to talk about the different ways that some of these policy ideas have been implemented in their own jurisdiction. But again, this web of ideas really highlights that these concepts that we've been talking about, social connection, design for aging in place, can really fit in different ways, and they can kind of take different forms. So just like the Moitel Leyland is not just about design, but it is about that process of creating housing joyfully. I encourage you to think about all of these different areas where you could be having an impact. So again, I know I talked a lot about design in the beginning. We've got our 6 design principles and our outcomes. So design does matter. I think it is a really important piece to get right. But there are so many other critical areas of action too, which we haven't talked about as much in this series. And there are lots of great resources on Hey Neighbour's website around the programming piece, for example. We're continuing to build the policy piece as we get to work with more and more municipalities to see how these ideas actually play out within their context. So, we need to think about existing buildings and new buildings at the same time. Again, new buildings are just a tiny part of our housing stock. And, it's important to design these to be sociable, age-friendly, getting the kind of programming and partnership innovations going. And, that's another thing that a lot of our partners are doing really well, like the City of New Westminster. They're doing some really great work around the programming piece. But then thinking about existing buildings, so how are we, preserving affordable units? The BC has the Rental Protections Fund, which is helping nonprofits actually acquire existing buildings and bring them from the market into the non-market. And then thinking about improvements and retrofits, that's something that we've been working on with Renewable Cities. So how can we take older buildings and actually make them more sociable? And again, that programming and partnership innovation piece is so important. So just a reminder of some of the policies that I did talk about, Port Moody, and we'll get to hear from Mary DePauli, who's the planner, the kind of planning lead in Port Moody. So we help them create their social well-being design guidelines. We're pretty excited to be actually working with them again this year, and we're going to be adding some of the family-friendly unit design considerations into this document. So that's an example of taking a policy that we've already worked on and adding kind of the next layer into it. And then the City of North Vancouver also has their active design guidelines. So they are actually also currently working on incorporating some of these into some of their new documents, including their form and zoning guidelines and their OCP. Other examples, Ryan's going to put this in the chat, but we did some building social connections policy case studies last year, so I encourage you to check it out. There is a really interesting policy in Brent in the UK, which is a kind of a suburb of London. So they have a residential amenity space and place quality supplementary planning document. Big name, but it is kind of similar to what we've done with the City of Port Moody guidelines. And then there are also some really great, family design guidelines that have come out recently. The City of Toronto, City of Victoria, I think, is on the call, City of New West. So these are all kind of areas where these principles around well-being and social connection can live. And really, I think we have a big challenge as planners and consultants, and as we work with each other to understand, like, what are all of these layers of policy? And I can't remember who said this, but if you remember those old projectors we all had in our classrooms in high school or university, or depending on your age, with those SSH sheets. And our policy layers can really start to become illegible after a while, because we keep kind of adding and things are changing. And also it's tricky because we don't see the results of our policy decisions for many years because construction takes so long. How do we kind of cut through all of these layers? And I encourage you all to be kind of critical with what you already have in your jurisdiction in terms of policy and what can be kind of tweaked and changed. And I do strongly think that this framing of social connection and multi-solving is a really good way forward to make those decisions. So again, I can't give you an overview of like every possible direction that you could go in, because there are a lot of ways, and we acknowledge that there are a lot of ways to kind of solve this and to advance it. And small changes to your existing policies could have a big impact as well. So just encouraging you to think through this roadmap and use it kind of critically in your own conversations when you take them back to your team. So thinking about kind of 5 key steps. So the why, which is like your purpose and desired impact. And really, if you have a really strong guiding star and guiding principles, it makes the work a lot easier. So who's involved and who's impacted. The what, which is what strategies and tools are you actually going to develop to achieve those outcomes. Where, so how is it being applied and integrated into your existing context, and then the how, which is how you're actually going to roll this out and implement it and track it over time. So going to the why, some of the kind of critical questions that we ask, which is, what matters most for your community, thinking about multi-solving. What are the kind of most pressing social issues that you need to deal with? And I know that the list is very long for all of our communities, but thinking where there are these opportunities to multi-solve, to say, if we do this, it will have an impact on these people and these people, and potentially a really great positive outcome. Really questioning whether the approach you're thinking about is the right one. So impact, equity, alignment with community goals. So why not? And then thinking about why now. So the kind of timing, emerging needs, and policy windows. And in a lot of these examples that we've talked about, that policy window and that champion, whether it's a mayor or a councillor, is really, really important. So we encourage you to start talking about these ideas early, and maybe it'll spark something for someone who will become a champion to say, we need to do this in our community. And having that champion, I think, is really critical. Thinking carefully about what your outcomes are. So what are you really trying to achieve? And then thinking early on about how you're going to actually measure success. So thinking about the example from Port Moody, again, as I said, this really started with a champion. It was a councillor who was really keen on this idea of design for social connection, and kind of directed the project to staff. So again, thinking about these ideas were percolating in this councillor's head in before 2020, and it took 4 years for the guidelines to be completed and approved. So these policy changes do take time, but getting the ideas into people's mind, I think, is a critical first step. And the other thing that we did with Port Moody is that we were really guided by these principles, and we spent a lot of time kind of agreeing on what they were. And when it came down to making decisions around incentives, for example, we use these guiding principles as kind of a critical decision-making framework. And again, Michelle has talked about this policy window. So because of the work that Hey Neighbour Collective did with partners to get this kind of kernel of policy into the Metro Vancouver strategy, it also created this window for us to do this work. So it can really start with something simple to catalyze kind of the momentum to start doing this work. So thinking about the who's really benefiting from the changes and why, who needs to be involved in the implementation, thinking about who needs to be engaged into the process, and thinking about who is responsible for monitoring and evaluation. Don't know why I couldn't say that word. But I think that piece is really important to say there are a lot of things that you could take on and say, this is the best policy possible, but it isn't actually implementable with the team you have and the resources you have. So you're just kind of setting yourself up for failure. So what is kind of the simplest way that you could get the outcome you want? And that is kind of the big challenge in all of this work. So some of the work we did with Port Moody, they already had a kind of citizen advisory committee set up. And I know a lot of you probably have something similar in your municipality. So we really used that group to help us make decisions, and we had a series of workshops with them to understand what was most important to them in terms of social well-being. And then the other critical piece was really talking to developers and architects who are working in the municipality. So we really got a sense of like, how is this going to sit with them when we actually implement the guidelines? Are they actually going to use this? Is this usable? Is it too specific, not specific enough? So we really got to understand a lot of what was happening. And they were all really eager to engage and be engaged in this policy. So the what, really the strategies and tools that you're going to use. So what kinds of policies or guidelines work best within your context? Are there existing regulations that need to be streamlined or updated? Thinking about those layers of acetate sheet, are there a bunch of layers that you can consolidate or take away? What housing types are you specifically worried about? So maybe you might be thinking about high-rise buildings or missing middle. There are a lot of different ways where social connection could be included. What's going to be kind of different from current practice, and how does that kind of change how your processes are playing out? Are there strategies that you feel really strongly about that you would like to incentivize or encourage? And there are lots of kind of levers that you can think about. Robert talked about some of them in his presentation. And then are there any trade-offs to what you're proposing as well? So kind of thinking about all of these things early on. So this spreadsheet was later on in the Port Moody process, and we had kind of an evaluation system for all of these different guidelines that we were proposing. And we kind of said, okay, where do they apply? What housing types do they apply to? We had the community priority, which we engaged through the workshop. We also had a city priority column. We had alignment with our 5 guiding principles that I shared. Sustainability or resilience impact, cost and complexity. And we kind of rank these as like 1 to 6 for each category. And that gave us kind of a composite score. And we were able to kind of say, this is really high in terms of priority across all of these different layers of thinking and of all of these conversations with these different groups. And that helped us kind of justify some of the incentives that we were applying. So there were some really good incentives, some really juicy incentives in there, and we were able to kind of allocate them to the most impactful actions. And again, we are currently working with Port Moody to kind of expand this to include unit design considerations, including kind of their family-friendly policy. So a really great way of kind of consolidating more of their policy layers into this really great document. And then some other examples, so that UK, which you can also hear a talk about this particular, we did a webinar with Natasha, who was the kind of responsible for this policy, also linked by Ryan in the chat, but thinking about different ways to kind of do this and different ways to think about your framework and toolkit. So finally, no, actually there's one more. So where is application and integration? Where in the policy ecosystem are these ideas going to live? So thinking back to Michelle's slide where she showed those circles coming together in different ways, there are a lot of different ways to do this. You don't have to create new guidelines. In some cases, it really won't make sense for you to create new guidelines, but thinking about where in the process does this actually fit in, and you'll have to kind of loop in different planners throughout your organization. So I think that's like one of the critical things we found with the cohort we worked with last fall was we had social planners and development planners and age-friendly planners. Not everyone has an age-friendly planner, but all of these different departments actually talking to each other and let's talk to engineering, or how do we actually make sure that this is working within the system. So with Port Moody, we kind of had to integrate with the official community plan, which is also now being updated. These sustainability report cards, which were already existing, and their family-friendly policy, which we're now kind of integrating back into the guidelines. And we kind of thought carefully about how the submission requirements were going to work within their existing current process. So finally, the how, the implementation. How is this going to be integrated into your workflows? How much buy-in and capacity is needed to actually implement this successfully? How will you test, pilot, and refine it? And then how will you monitor uptake and effectiveness? So again, we're just in the really early stages of Port Moody. We're starting to see some examples come through, and you are welcome to ask questions to Mary if you're curious about how the implementation is rolling out. We also did some work with the City of North Vancouver a few years ago to evaluate their active design guidelines. So we did a very detailed report where we went back and actually visited buildings that had been built that were using some of the guideline elements to see, how are these actually performing in the real world? How are residents actually using these spaces? So we did a municipality-wide survey. We did some detailed post-occupancy evaluations, some focus groups, and interviews with the planners and developers who had actually used the guidelines. So just to recap our roadmap, we've got our why, who, what, where, how, and this is just really a starting point to help you start to understand where these pieces might fit in. And again, there are lots of different ways to think about this, so I encourage you to reflect on what you heard from the experts about how social connection is kind of integrating into their work in different ways.